All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thought we had it. There we go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll call our hearing to order. This is a committee hearing on a professional licensure study committee. This is our second hearing on this topic, and it's our intention that this will be our final hearing. As I hope you are aware, our resolution sets forth the parameters of what it is we're going to consider in this hearing, and that is board's operation and funding. So what we're looking at is how the various licensed professions boards, the 41 boards attached to the Secretary of State's office, currently operate, the level of service they provide, whether or not they have adequate funding to provide that level of service, and any recommendations that would make modifications to that level of service or the funding that is necessary to serve your profession. We're not taking testimony on anything outside those parameters. We're not going to hear testimony of any profession that is thus far unlicensed that would like to be licensed. We're not taking any testimony on anyone that wants to move their administrative attachment from one department to another. We're not taking testimony on any interprofessional license spats or disputes about a service level or scope of service or anything such as that. So I want to hear from the various licensed professions. I want to hear from individuals and individual practitioners, but we are going to ask that you keep your comments narrowly focused on what it is that the resolution authorizes this committee to study. I'll be the arbiter if we get outside the yellow lines, and we'll politely ask you to move back to the center of the road if that should happen. We're going to start and hear some industry testimony. Hopefully, we'd like to hear from testimony from any of from the perspective of any of the boards, the various licensed boards. And at the conclusion of that, then I'd like to open it up for testimony from any individual practitioner or anyone from the public that just has a general comment or concern, again, within the parameters of our resolution on how professional licensure, the provision of services in the state might be improved. For those of you that weren't with us at our first meeting, we heard from both the GORC, the Georgia Occupation Regulatory Review Commission, as well as the Business License Division of the Secretary of State's office. I think that testimony was very helpful. I suspect we've got 3 or 4 recommendations out of that first hearing from our state partners on how modifications could be made to improve board operations and funding going forward. So that was very helpful. We had a sign-in sheet, and I've got a number that have signed up thus far. Is there anyone else in the audience at the moment that wishes to offer testimony that did not sign up? Okay. Very quickly, we have, and we did formal introductions at our first meeting, but very quickly we have Representative Karen Bennett, Representative Dominic LaRicchia, Representative Rick Williams, and our Representative Jody Lott is unable to attend today, so she won't be with us. And I'm Representative Brett Harrell, and will chair our hearing today. We'll start off first with Michael Sullivan, who is going to provide some testimony. And Michael, if you'll tell us not only who you represent, but if your testimony also would include any of the other associated professions.
My name is Michael Sullivan. Sully is what people call me when I'm in the room. And I'm the president and CEO of the American Council of Engineering Companies of Georgia. We're the trade association for Georgia's engineering industry. The licensure board that represents our industry is the Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors Board, or PELS board as we call it. And I had a 40-minute presentation, but Brett, when you Mr. Chairman, when you gave all those things that we couldn't talk about, it's been greatly reduced. So let me get started in respect of your time. Engineers have been licensed in Georgia since 1937. I think we're one of the oldest professional licensing boards in the state. but an unhappiness with the service that our licensees were getting was literally one of the first problems presented to me when I took this job in 2012. And the problems went back much further than 2012. I think there was a study done in 2005 that you were a part of, studying how to solve some of those issues, and it's a problem that's existed for many, many years in numerous different administrations. From simple things like, can I get my calls returned? Can I find out whether I passed the exam? To some serious concern about violations that were threatened, violations which frankly threaten public health, safety, and welfare. And it's gotten to the point where some people think that there's not much reason to report those kinds of violations because they don't think there's going to necessarily be a resolution to that. But I want to be clear at the outset, this is not a problem with the appointed members of the PELS board, the folks appointed by the governor to serve on the licensure board. It's not a problem with the Secretary of State as an individual. It's not a problem with the Secretary of State's office as an institution, nor is it a problem with the Secretary of State's staff members. They are, all of those people, particularly the Secretary of State's staff and the Secretary of State's office, are hardworking and doing the best they can with the money they are appropriated. But looking at the problem, I quickly found out the problems we were having were not unique to engineers and surveyors, and I imagine some of you who are licensed professionals are probably, some of that sounds familiar to you. It's a systemic problem. It's a problem across professions, and the complaints across professions are strikingly similar. And it doesn't take an engineer to figure out what the problem is, which is good because I'm not an engineer. In fact, I can't even do simple division. So, but the problem, as so many problems are, is money. Simple problem, simple solution. And it's a result of being severely under budgeted. The professional licensing division is understaffed, overworked, and spread too thin in trying to manage the diverse licensing and regulatory functions of 41 different professional licensing boards and more than 500,000 individual licensees those boards represent. That's a lot of ground to cover for a very small, relatively small staff. And with occupations ranging from nurses and engineers and architects and land surveyors all the way to barbers and cosmetologists, it is not difficult to imagine the challenges of the same relatively few staff members providing services across so many different types of professions with wildly different examinations, applications, service call and complaint volumes, and disciplinary investigation types. And to add to that difficulty, the professional licensing division is forced to operate on a budget that is less than half what all of those licensing boards together collectively collect in fees each and every year. Now, you heard testimony from the Secretary of State's office at the last meeting that the licensing fees and fines that are assessed by all the licensing boards within the professional licensing division cumulatively generate approximately $20 million per year into the state's general fund, but their budget is approximately $8 million. Now, I can do this math. That's a $12 million delta, but it's not just a $12 million delta, that's a tax. And it's not a problem that's caused by the Secretary of State. They can't appropriate their own funds. It's a problem caused by the General Assembly. It's an appropriations problem, but that's good because you guys are the General Assembly, so you're the perfect people to solve this kind of problem. And that's the good news. But I want to emphasize it's not just a problem. This isn't just an inconvenience. This isn't just an unfortunate circumstance. That $12 million delta between what those 500,000 licensees are cumulatively paying to the state for licensing services and the actual cost of the services they are receiving is a de facto tax on those professionals. Make no mistake, it's not an oopsie. It's a tax. It's a $12 million tax on licensed professionals for which they receive nothing in return. And that's not just a bad thing or an unfortunate thing. It's in direct contravention of OCGA 43-1-7, which requires, and I quote, the total amount of fees charged by the Professional Licensing Board shall approximate the total of the direct and indirect costs to the state of the operations of the board. It's in violation of Georgia Code. And as a result of that situation, several licensing boards have fought to achieve some level of independence in an effort to obtain an improved service level for their licensees. And that effort goes way, way back. I may have a white beard today, but back in 1977, when I was 8 years old and standing in line to see Star Wars, the Georgia Real Estate Commission brought a lawsuit that resulted in a declaration that if the state did not appropriate all of the license fees that it collected for regulation of the commission, then the state should reduce the license fees to a level commensurate with the actual expenditures. In response to this court ruling, the General Assembly removed the Real Estate Commission from the Professional Licensing Division's general budget and made the commission a separate budget unit with its own line item in the state budget, which then allowed them to set their own service level and collect licensing fees based on the cost of delivering that level of service. Other professions have sought to be removed from the Secretary of State's office and attached to other agencies as an attempt to solve their problem. In 2003, both the pharmacy and dentistry boards were removed and placed under the Department of Community Health. In 2014, the Georgia State Board of Accountancy was placed under the State Accounting Office. And in 2018, the Nursing Board fought unsuccessfully to be placed under the Department of Community Health, like the dentists and pharmacists, in the belief that the Department of Community Health would be a more appropriate agency for regulating the nursing profession, with its much higher need to protect the public health and welfare and more than 190,000 licensees. That's, frankly, the route that my folks wanted me to take. Let's find a way to get somewhere else that'll solve our problem. But three things occurred to me in thinking about that. First, the problem is systemic. It's across numerous professions, but we, and when I say we, I mean the licensed professions and the members of the General Assembly, we've been trying to solve this problem one profession at a time. The pharmacists and the dentists and the Real Estate Commission and so on and so forth, by just moving them to another state agency. And second, it doesn't really make sense for the General Assembly to move professional licensing boards across a bunch of different state agencies, which were created for other purposes besides professional licensing, when the state already has a perfectly good professional licensing division office created for that very purpose. And the third thing that occurred to me, and most importantly, just moving a licensing board to another agency doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Because again, remember, the problem is money. And as long as that board is subject to the annual appropriations process and at the mercy of the annual appropriations process, they still may not be able to deliver the service that they would like to provide because they don't control their own destiny. That's because there's a total disconnect that currently exists between the licensing fees charged by a board and the annual appropriation given to that board to operate. So that problem can only be solved by introducing legislation that does three things. First, it needs to give individual licensing boards, each individual licensing board, the ability to determine the service level it would like to provide to its licensees. That means deciding their own staffing levels. Do they need their own executive director? Are they happy to share with other professions? Do they need their own investigators or other administrative staff, or can they share those as well? Do they need their own office? Where does it need to be located? For example, professional engineers, about 85% of the engineers in Georgia and the engineering companies in Georgia are located in the metro Atlanta area. That would probably be the logical place for our office to be located. Second, it needs to give each board the commensurate ability to set a licensing fee that will pay for the costs associated with delivering that service level. Third, you have to create some sort of statutory or, in an ideal world, constitutional guarantee that the board will actually receive a budgetary appropriation approximate to the total of fees it's charging. And that third point is really the most important point. The statutory protection is important because the appropriations process, well, let's just say it often involves looking for new and untapped sources of revenue. So cutting the budget of the professional licensing division while reaping the windfall of the revenue generated is always going to be a temptation, even years and years and years later. And this is most particularly true in lean budget years, which is also when some of the members of professions may be most tempted to cut corners or skirt regulations which protect public health, safety, and welfare, and when enforcement staff will be most sorely needed. We certainly saw this in the engineering profession during the economic downturn. Folks were doing some things that they probably ought not have been doing because they felt like they had to because of the economic circumstances. And, we may have some folks from the barbering profession here today. When a barber makes a mistake, unless it's, cutting your ear off, that mistake will usually grow back. But when bridges and buildings fall down, they don't grow back. The statutory constitutional protection is also important for another reason, and I'll try to keep the politics out of politics, which I think is impossible, but let me give you some names. Max Cleland, Lewis Massey, Kathy Cox, Karen Handel, Brian Kemp. These are the last 5 secretaries of state, and they've all run for a higher office. Members of the General Assembly, I've heard, haven't experienced this personally, often have ambitions for higher office sometimes, and may see the Secretary of State as a potential rival for those ambitions. And as we move from a solidly red state to maybe more of a purple state where both parties are competitive at the statewide level, governors now may also see the Secretary of State as a potential rival for their second term. and this makes the Secretary of State's office a potentially appealing target for budget cuts. So I think the temptation is always there when appropriators are looking for money, but that may make it even more attractive. But putting everything I've set aside today, I would propose a little thought exercise for just a moment, if you would. If you were creating a system of how to fund professional licensing from scratch today, wouldn't the best possible system be just this type of user fee system where each profession could determine the administrative support structure that best meets its needs and then have the members of that profession, and only the members of that profession, bear all the costs of administrating that system in the form of their own licensure fees? It's a user fee. The folks receiving the service are the folks who pay for the service. I can't speak for other professions, but I know that's how engineer licensure is done in our surrounding neighbor states and many others across the nation. Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Texas all do it exactly that way. So you may be asking yourselves, how could we do this? I'm no expert on either professional licensing or the appropriations process, but as best I can tell you, you've got three options. First, you could pass a constitutional amendment. That's probably the best way to do that. That's the most certain way to do that. And this would allow licensure fees to be segregated rather than deposited into the general fund as required by Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph 2 of the Georgia Constitution. There are lots of exemptions, however, already in the Constitution to that particular provision. Here are some of the exemptions that the General Assembly has already seen fit to create segregated fees for: agricultural fees, workers' comp fund, various court fees and fines, State Children's Trust Fund, Seed Capital Fund, Indigent Care Trust Fund, Emerging Crops Fund, Brain and Spinal Injury Trust Fund, Roadside Enhancement and Beautification Fund, Dog and Cat Reproductive Sterilization Support Program. Meow. Dedication of fees from special license plates to agencies or nonprofit corporation. There's actually a segregation that can go to nonprofit corporations. Safe Harbor for Sexually Exploited Children Fund. The excise tax imposed by general law on the sale of fireworks dedicated to the provision of trauma care, fire services, and local public safety purposes. And of course, the excise tax on motor fuel, which is dedicated in the Constitution of Roads and Bridges. Constitutional amendment is obviously the heaviest lift. You've got to get your constitutional majority in the House and the Senate, but it would provide the highest protection, and I would submit to you would provide very little controversy. This should not be a controversial proposal that licensure fees go to support the operations of the licensing board that imposes them. And it's been done many times, and this proposal would likely be met with little or no controversy. So that's the first way. The second way would be to make each licensing board a separate budget unit pursuant to the Budget Act. That's what the General Assembly did with the Real Estate Commission in 1977 as a result of that lawsuit. I would submit that maybe 41 new budgetary units might not be the best solution, might not be an ideal solution. And you also, and I think this is important, you lose the ability to realize the economies of scale that can come from the combined professional licensure division staff. Not every profession is going to want to be its own independent budgetary unit. They may want to share those resources and be able to avail themselves of the benefits of the professional licensing division. The third option would be to split the baby with a statutory solution. And what I would propose is similar to what we did in House Bill 170, the Transportation Funding Act of 2015, as it related to the $5 per night hotel-motel fee that was charged. Of course, the excise taxes in that bill were constitutionally dedicated to roads and bridges. The $5 fee, what they did was they basically provided that if in any year the General Assembly didn't appropriate the amount that was raised by that fee, the amount would be reduced by 50%. Of course, in this case, a 50% reduction wouldn't actually be much to scare the General Assembly, because with $20 million coming in and $8 million being budgeted, 50% reduction would actually be an increase in what the licensed professions are currently receiving in the budget. So we would propose a much higher penalty to that to make sure that it actually did create some pain. We also believe that appropriate checks and balances should be put in place to ensure that the service levels and fees are reasonable, and particularly that they do not create an unnecessary barrier to entry for any licensed profession. We don't need licensure fees being used as a gatekeeping function. So an annual audit and report to the General Assembly, which has the appropriations power, and the Governor's Office, which is where the appointees of the licensing boards come from, would be a good start. In addition, we would also recommend providing funding for the existing Georgia Occupational Regulatory Review Council that would allow the council to provide better and more frequent oversight of occupational licensing. I do have copies of just a quick and dirty versions of both the constitutional amendment draft and the statutory draft. I'd be happy to share with the committee. We look forward to continuing to work with the committee, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any committee members have questions of Mr. Sullivan at this moment? Mr. Sullivan, give us, so to kind of sum up, I understand that you want to move toward more fee-for-service, more autonomy for the board to determine that level of service. Can you give me an example in your particular industry of maybe an expansion of service level that you don't have today, that it would be that your industry would desire?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's so much an expansion, but for example, some of our regulatory infraction investigations, we, for example, would like those to be done by a licensed professional engineer who ideally is familiar with the subject matter. That would make those investigations, more effective. I know a lot of our folks would like to have an office that was located in Atlanta rather than in Macon, because it's difficult for some of our folks to get there for the meetings with the distance from where most of our folks are. I don't know. Yeah, again, I don't know that it's so much a different type of service that we would provide, just a more robust level, some efficiencies, some responsiveness that we'd like to address.
In your estimation, is your particular industry that is generating license fees for the operation of the Pels Board, in your particular estimation, you feel that the total sum fees coming in to the state for the operation of the Pels Board exceeds the cost of the level of service, and therefore that difference in total, $12 million, that total difference is not in your industry or your board, but it's your estimation that your board is a net contributor, and that contribution over and above the expense to operate the board, using your words, was a tax. And it could also be seen, could it not, as a subsidy to another profession that total revenue does not cover the cost of operating their board and the level of service their profession receives, and therefore is it not possible that one profession could be subsidizing a totally unrelated profession under the current scenario?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. Cumulatively, obviously, all of the licensed professions as a cohort are being taxed to the tune of $12 million a year. But how you divide that within the professional licensing division, when you have executive directors and staff that are serving multiple boards with disparate numbers of licensees, disparate licensure fees, it would be hard to unpack. But it's certainly possible to suggest that some of the licensed professions, which have a large number of licensed professionals, so 190,000 nurses or 30,000 engineers, that even if their individual licensure fees did not look exorbitant, that the totality of those amounts compared to the service that they were receiving made them donors to the office that then subsidized professions which maybe had smaller numbers of licensees, for sure.
And just as a reminder to committee members, in the last couple of sessions, we had legislation that originated and came out of the House Ways and Means Committee that would have provided a constitutional amendment to allow the dedication of all fees, whereas Mr. Sullivan is suggesting a measure that could potentially allow dedication of the licensure fees, the measure that has not yet become law, but again, as your testimony suggested, the general public says, if you collect a fee for a tire, $1 for a tire, it ought to go for tire cleanup. If you collect a fee for whatever the purpose was, it ought to go for that purpose and not be diverted to another purpose, how well-intended the other purpose may be. So just for the committee's edification, just keep in mind there may be accomplish what Mr. Sullivan has suggested with regard to licensing fees could potentially be accomplished even in a larger measure that would impact all fee dedication in the state.
And Mr. Chairman, we supported that bill in the last session. I know it passed the House, never got a hearing in the Senate, but we did support that legislation. And when you look at those exemptions, we're already on letter P in the number of exemptions that are in that one code section in the Constitution. A better approach might be to create one blanket exemption that would allow for the dedication of fees subsequent to that.
All right, seeing no final questions, thank you, Mr. Sullivan,
Thank
for
you,
your
Mr. Chairman,
testimony.
committee members.
We'll now hear from our licensed professional counselors. Ms. Mackey?
Hi, thank you for allowing me to present today. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for summarizing a good portion of what I was going to say, because it also applies to the Georgia Board of Professional Counselors, Social Workers, and Marriage and Family Therapists. Since joining the Licensed Professional Counselor as their CEO 16 years ago, I've attended almost all of the monthly meetings, and I too can attest on how hard that staff works and how hard they try to provide service to the applicants. I want to give you an idea. We do a license consultation at our office. This notebook contains about 2 months' worth of the communication that the staff tries to help the applicant with the process. So the staff works exceptionally hard. I'm told that our staff of 3 oversees 9 other boards. Our board is a composite board made of 3. Georgia is proud to say that we were one of the first to be licensed to license our mental health professionals. Since that time, a handful of universities offered the master's degree. A person has to then intern for 4 years, pass a national exam in order to apply for licensure. In that time, Georgia has grown to 25 brick and mortar universities that are offering degrees, plus 80 online universities in which our military uses being deployed overseas. So applications at the licensing board are not going to slow down. These universities each university produces 60 applicants approximately per year, times 25 universities, plus the online universities. We're seeing our applications simply overload the staff and the board members. They're not able to do policy. They're not able to spend time on ethics complaints. The Marriage and Family Therapists section, of which there are 3 LPCs on the board, 3 LMFTs, and 3 LCSWs, licensed clinical social workers, licensed marriage and family therapists, and licensed professional counselors. The group, the MFTs, worked for 5 years to make some corrections and 2 paragraph upgrades in their rule. Why did it take so long? Mainly our board spends a lot of time on the professional counselors, simply because there are 8,000 licensed professional counselors in the state, approximately 3,000 licensed clinical social workers, and approximately 800 marriage and family therapists, but they work as a unit. So I just want to once again thank you for summarizing the difficulty that the staff is up against. Thank you for also talking about the ethical issues. The ethical complaints are taking an exceptionally long time. If a licensed professional counselor has a client who's a child in the middle of a contested divorce, and the non-custodian parent asks for records, obviously the LPC, the mental health professional, is not going to give them the records. A complaint is filed with the licensing board. If that LPC is notified that they have an ethical complaint filed against them, they must report to the insurance panels. The insurance panels removes them from the panel. They no longer can collect reimbursement for seeing the client. Most of my members, and I have 5,000 members, are independent business people. When they can't get reimbursed from their insurance company, you have a clog in the system. So I don't know if you have any other questions, but I did want to refer to our application fee is one of the lowest in the United States, and I will email this to you. It's complete documentation about becoming a licensed professional counselor across the United States. Alaska is a little bit cheaper than we are, less expensive for the application fee. So I will email that to you. But we would really like to see staff be brought on. Again, the staff works very hard down there, tremendous amount of communication getting people through the process, but it's not slowing down. Last month, they reported they had 350 applications, new applications. One thing that the staff and the board did that was creative, the licensed professional counselors, social workers and marriage and family therapists on the board review every single application because the work that they do out in the field can be complicated. But in order to speed up the process, if they've reviewed the application and all that's missing is the exam test score, they have authorized their staff, when the test score goes in, move ahead and make sure the person's communicated with that they are licensed. So they have tried very creative ways to move the applications through as quickly as possible. Thank you for your time. Did you have any questions?
Any members of the committee have a question for Ms. Mackey? Representative LaRicchia, you're number 23.
And I meant to ask the other gentleman, but when we talk about the fees, I guess they're different for every group. What do y'all mind sharing? What the
It's $100 for the
Okay.
application fee.
Sully?
Our renewal fees are $50. They renew every 2 years.
Okay, I just guess in our first meeting I probably missed it, but I guess they're different for every group, ranging from 50 to 350 or more, I guess.
Each board decides their own fee.
Okay, all right.
Not much the same as regular.
Representative Williams.
Too. Thank you very much. Both of you have been a wealth of information. If you have a complaint against LPC, who investigates that complaint? Do you have investigators out of your office?
I'll tell you that one of the government processes that I'm most impressed with is the security and the confidentiality in which our licensing board and the Secretary of State handle ethical complaints. The only reason that we hear them is over the course of 16 years of being there is people will come to us and say, a complaint's been filed against me, what do I do? This is the situation. Most of what we're seeing is in divorce cases where there's a custody issue. That seems to be the highest amount of complaints. Again, the process is very secure as far as how it is handled. I don't really have any insider information. I do know that when a complaint comes in from someone, we do direct them to the Secretary of State's website, has an online form in which it's sent in. I do know of others that have told me they have reported a situation and what they got back was a detailed letter. I understand from some others that have gone through the process and trying to clear up a situation where it's very complicated with records and HIPAA and confidentiality. So there's not a lot of information that a mental health professional can release to a non-client. So those are mostly the complaints that people are seeing. It's a paperwork record issue.
Mr. Chairman, can I go further? What I'm asking, maybe I misstated my question. If your board receives a complaint on a counselor, who investigates? Does your board have an investigator?
No, we're a nonprofit professional organization. We do have an ethics chair and an ethics committee, and they do an initial consultation. And then if it's something simple where we explain who can have paperwork and who cannot, if it's not, we tell them it's their responsibility under the Code of Ethics 135-7 for them to report to the licensing board.
Okay. And so that's
That would be, we have a pool of investigators at the Secretary of State's office.
okay.
That would be,
That
If
would
you don't
come under
mind, would you
y'all.
come to the podium and give us your name, if you don't mind? And if you don't mind, give us your name and the organization you were with.
Hi, I'm Darren Mickler. I'm the acting division director for the Professional Licensing Boards,
All right, Darren.
as well as the executive director of the engineering board for the last 17 years.
Okay.
But we do have a pool of investigators. I think we've had as many as 20, and now maybe we have 15. It's difficult, in this climate. They can move to cities, counties, and get more money. It's been difficult to hold on to them. It's difficult to get them trained and then keep them. But we do have a pool that does everything from nursing to engineering to cosmetology. So it's, they see a lot of different things.
So, I'm sorry, can I go ahead?
Let me do this.
Yeah.
If you'll, let me pause for a moment, if you'll step back, because you're probably going to generate a couple of questions, and we may come back to you in just a moment, if you don't mind. But, Ms. Mackey, if you'll come back up, because there'll be a follow-up on that investigation question, I'm sure, and I've got one myself. But Any other question for Ms. Mackey? Let me ask one or two. So you mentioned this past month about 350 applications in the board. I presume this is a new application for someone that's seeking a new license. And your testimony was the board reviews each and every one of those.
Yes, there are 3 LPCs on the board, 3 LMFTs, and 3 LCSWs.
On a renewal application, does the board review those, or are they administratively approved by SOS?
By SOS, it's an online system, except for the audits. When they are audited, they do review each audit in reference to their continuing education.
Okay.
But when they go to renew, they go online and pay a fee.
Okay, so the renewal is completely, you check off the boxes. All the boxes are checked, your license is renewed.
Yes, sir.
Share just a brief moment, I don't want to keep you too much longer. What is the board subjectively looking at on that initial license?
On the initial application?
Yeah, on that initial application for license, yes, ma'am.
They're looking specifically at the work environment and at the clinical supervision and the supervisor.
And that is a characteristic or experience or level that clearly the board feels cannot be administratively approved?
Yes, absolutely.
And-
Work environment is very unique in Georgia. You have several different layers, and a lot of our counselors, interns, may have 4 different jobs.
Okay. Okay, very good. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Now, if you don't mind, and Darren, I think, let me let Representative Williams continue and follow up
Okay,
with that
thank
level of questioning.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure how the investigations went on the different, like engineers. So your investigators would investigate a complaint on an engineering firm?
Sure.
And how are your investigators trained to investigate an engineering firm?
All right, well, the way it starts, we receive the application or the complaint into the office. We review it, and then we have a board member, an engineer, who we call him the cognizant, because he's the only one who will know which firm that we're investigating. He'll look at it, determine if it's a valid complaint, then he'll write up what he wants the investigator to go find. What information does he need for the board to make a decision? We'll give that to the investigator and send them out to do that. And I think they do a great job with what they have,
I think so. I think the problem is the number of investigators and the number of complaints you have. I know that you're shorthanded.
I think we've seen quite a few of the license types where complaints have doubled
Yeah,
in the last year. I know engineers were very close to doubling this past
really.
year.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mickler, and this may be, just a complete outsider's thinking, so correct me where I'm wrong. But you have an investigator that's investigating a number of different professions and different industries. What happens when there's a complaint that requires industry-specific knowledge? What does your investigator do in that instance?
He'll bring the information back, and we can hire a subject matter expert. I think $300 we have to hire a subject matter expert.
So there's an investigation. The investigator goes out on the field, or potentially goes out in the field to a particular location, makes a determination that there's some industry-specific knowledge that would be helpful to know whether or not this is a valid complaint or not. The investigator realizes he doesn't have the ability to make that judgment on the spot. So now he comes back to the office,
Correct.
goes through a process of retaining an outside expert to review that data and make a recommendation.
That's correct.
All right, so that's clearly could be a bottleneck, right? I mean, of getting an answer. Representative Bennett. Wait.
Thank you so much, and I apologize if I'm asking a question that you've already answered, because my mind went for a second after lunch. Two questions. The qualifications of your investigators, did you mention what the qualifications are of your investigators? And the second question would be for when the investigator comes back in, recognizing that they do not have the specific knowledge needed, does that investigator hire or retain the specific industry investigator?
The first question, we usually hire investigators that have been with Sheriff's Department, Police Department. You know, they're already post-certified. That's where we get most of those. And the second question.
The second one was when they decide or determine, when that investigator determines that they need a industry-specific person to go out and
Right.
research that,
So-
does that investigator then hire, or how does that work?
No, they would come back to the office, and we could ask maybe the professional society to find us someone qualified in that area.
Okay, thank you.
And Sully wanted me to make sure you guys knew, we have inspectors and we have investigators. So the inspectors, they're, I think, you understand that, okay.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have, I think, Dr. Bachtel, Advanced Practice Nursing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting me have just a couple minutes. I too will thank Mr. Silva. He did point to a lot of concerns that I have about the funding and such of the nursing board as well. But my name, again, is Molly Bachtel. I'm a Georgia registered nurse. I've been licensed for about 23 years now as a registered nurse. I pay $65 every 2 years for my RN license, if you want to know, and another $65 every 2 years for my APRN authorization. It's not a separate license, but authorization to practice. I'm a family nurse practitioner. I have 2 clinical practices, one at a student health service, the other at a children's hospital fast track area where I take care of primary care concerns for kids. And then I'm on clinical faculty at a school of nursing as well. First and foremost, like others, I want to emphasize that the perspective I offer today as a longtime RN licensed here in Georgia is in no way a criticism of the Board of Nursing or the Office of the Secretary of State. To the contrary, as a Georgia RN, I'm fairly engaged in professional advocacy work over the last few years that I have nothing but respect for what they've been able to do, some improvements they've been able to make with a limited budget. My observations are they are doing the best job possible given the limited resources, and so I too am of the opinion that the fees I pay as a licensee should go to the Board of Nursing so we can have a well-regulated profession. Nursing is the most trusted profession many years running, and we want to keep it that way. We want patients of Georgia to have safe nursing care and have an effective Board of Nursing as part of that, and having more of our fees go towards the Board of Nursing. Again, under 50% of our fees probably end up there. I think maybe we collect about $6 million a year in renewals. There's, I don't know, about 160 or somebody said 190,000 licensed nurses in Georgia. But so I'd like for there to be more funding and more control over the hiring and getting the software and hardware they need to have update systems so we can be effective here in Georgia. I think it was said in a previous meeting, there's about $18 million collected for all licensees under Secretary of State, while only about $8.5 million or maybe 47% ends up under the Board of Nursing. I don't know what the Board of Nursing gets of that comes. We are one of the I guess we are the largest licensed group under Secretary of State. I too have heard from colleagues who've been in Mississippi and Alabama that they get 100% of their fees to manage their boards of nursing. So I would hope we could follow something along those lines moving forward, so we can have a board with more autonomy and be more effective. You have the complaints that come in where there's the nurse that shouldn't be practicing, perhaps that there's something that really did happen, or a false allegation, and it can take over a year sometimes to clear up. I met somebody in clinical practice over here, did some site visits who this happened just some weird complaint. There was nothing to it, but it took over a year to, clear her name. It's a huge cloud hanging over your head, and we want complaints to be resolved as promptly as possible, and have nurses that aren't safe to practice not practicing as soon as possible. But thank you for your time. I'm open to any questions you may have.
Any member of the committee have questions for Dr. Bechtel? Representative Williams?
I do. Thank you. And your board members, how many board members do you have on your board?
Well, I'm not on the board. I'm just a licensee. I would refer to the Board of Nursing if they'd like to answer that question. There's 13, I am told.
13? What is the average length of those board members serve? Do you have a turnover, or do you have someone that gets on that board and stays for generations? Or reappointed?
Okay. This is Dr. Janice Isler.
And you, I'm sorry, your name again?
I'm Janice Isler. I'm president of the Board of Nursing.
Thank
And
you.
first of all, thanks for doing this committee. And I had not prepared testimony, but I am happy to answer your questions
Thank
along
you.
this line. We have a 13-member board. Each board member does have a designated seat, whether it's an advanced practice, an LPN, nursing administrators. We really cover the entire population with our board members. We are appointed to 3-year terms and are eligible for a repeat term. So we're eligible for a maximum of 6 years on the board.
Great, thank you. May I have a question, Sully? You have a state board of engineers?
Yes, and our executive director is right here. Similarly, we have members that are appointed to represent certain practice disciplines as well as a surveyor. We share a board, the engineers and surveyors share a licensing board. And when they refer to the cognizant, depending on what the violation or the accusation was, which engineering discipline that related to, that would be the person that would handle it.
How many board members on your board?
3. Yeah, it's 9.
9?
1 consumer member, 1 surveyor member, the rest are professional engineers.
Okay. How many terms can they serve? Are they limited?
I don't think ours are limited.
They serve 5-year terms.
And they can be reappointed?
I think one of them's been on there since before I was born. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
We have some longtime members, but also there's been some recent turnover where we got some. So it's a good mix of longtime board members and some newer folks.
okay.
It varies by board too.
Yeah.
And those people do a good job.
They do a great job, a tremendous job. But, frankly, and I think staff would agree with this, I mean, there's a lot of work, and the staff and the budget's not getting any bigger. Somebody's got to take up that slack, and frankly, the board members are helping with that as well, and taking up that slack, and they're volunteers. They don't get paid.
They don't get a per
Well, I mean, they
diem.
get the per diem, but,
Okay.
they got day jobs. And our engineers are pretty busy right now. A lot of engineering work going on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, for the nurses, and certainly don't want to get off into some of the complaints, because I have had some nurses that contacted us over the years and say, I'm waiting on my approval or whatever, and I guess they go online, and some of these hospitals will actually call you and say, hey, I've just hired a person that's waiting on their license to be approved, and we would have to make some calls to say, hey, kind of what's going on. But you said $65 and how many nurses? 190,000?
Around 100.
So that's got to be one of the largest.
We are the largest
Groups.
board under the Secretary of State.
And so now this is going to be a budget question that perhaps maybe you can't answer, but we've heard from engineers and nursing and so forth, but and counselors. And this may be a question for our chairman, but I'm still just kind of listening and trying to imagine why all of that money doesn't go to the licensing, the licensing division or whatever.
That's on us.
And
That's us.
that's right. And
That's
so
Yeah,
over the
like
years,
the realtors, yeah, I mean, that's.
I guess over the years, would that have been an appropriation or something by the governor or just the legislature or both?
Included in the budget process. It's an appropriation throughout the appropriations process. So part of I think the work of this committee is if we are in agreement that more of that funding, if not all that funding,
Right.
needs to go to the licensed professions, then part of our work will be to go out and communicate with our fellow House and Senate members the importance of allocating those funds where they're generated, short of some other kind of constitutional amendment. Representative Bennett?
Thank you. I have a process question. The volunteers that serve on each individual board, the board members, are the board members reviewing the applications, or is it staff, a general pool of staff that review the applications?
It's both. Usually, or some boards have, engineers in particular have what we call model law. If they went to Georgia Tech or some accredited college, and they have 4 years' experience under a licensed professional, and they've had both of their exams, staff can just say, okay, they're good, send them on. If they're more difficult than that, or some other boards, they have their board members review the application. Some boards, all of the applications are reviewed by board members. Yeah, I think for most of us, it's a mix.
Could I follow up? Could I ask the nursing board who reviews your applications?
We have guidelines that allows the staff to go ahead and administer the license if indeed there is nothing outside the abnormal. Their NCLEX is passed, their criminal background check is fine, everything, there's no history of arrests or anything like that. Anything out of the ordinary then comes to the board.
One more, Mr. Chair, thank you so much. And so does each individual board have their own staff that are paid through your percentage of money that comes to your board?
The Board of Nursing, if I'm remembering correctly, has 19 staff members that work exclusively for the Board of Nursing.
And is that consistent with all of the different types of?
The engineers are grouped in with architects, interior designers, foresters, geologists, and landscape architects. So our staff of 4 reviews applications and complaints for all those, I think, for each section. And we have 6 or
There's 3 healthcares, nursing is sort of standalone. We have 4 trades.
4 trades. So,
Multiple boards.
and each of those, they have multiple license types that the staff reviews.
There is a varying level of staff support for the various boards, and many of the staff serve multiple boards.
Mr. Chairman, if I could answer Representative Laricchia's question, code section that provides for the licensed profession specifically says that the professional licensing division shall be one budgetary unit, so it's not divided up among any of the professions, so the whole pot goes in there. Again, I said I wasn't good at math, but 65.
$11,700,000.
Well, every year it would be $5,850,000. So just the nurses are paying $5,850,000. 65 divided by 2 would be. I'm sorry, 65 every other year would be 32, right? So it'd be $32 a year times 180,000 licensees. That's $5.85 million a year.
UAPRNs have 2 licenses.
Yeah.
We have a nursing license, so we pay $140.
And your total licensing division budget is 8.
Right, got it. All right, thank you. Let's get back on track. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Let me mention too, because twice the state of Alabama has been mentioned, and in one of our earlier, in our first hearing, we had a little discussion about Alabama as well. And the point was made that Georgia invests about $8 million total to operate all our boards, and Alabama is spending $38 to $40 million a year operating all their boards. But keep in mind now, that is 100% industry revenue. It's not taxpayer funds paying this board. It's a higher level of service being provided for that. So, and what we've heard from a number of the practitioners today, if I heard correctly, was we need a higher level of service. First, consider funding us with the money we're already paying. But then 2, if our level of service exceeds that, we're willing to pay to generate the level of service as Dr. Bechtel mentioned. You know, nurses are seen as one of the most favored professions, and that's, you know, you don't want a black eye on that profession. They're invested in maintaining a high level of public standard in the you know, in the public, and so they want their board to operate efficiently and effectively. So Alabama does operate a little differently. The investment is different in Alabama, but it is paid by the various industries that are being licensed. So it's not a burden on anyone other than the industry that's demanding that level of service. If you want to come to the microphone if you have a quick comment. And then we're going to move to, is it Mr. Davis from Nursing Association?
Carol Hayes, I'm a nurse midwife, have been for 30 years here in Georgia. I'm licensed in Alabama also, and I can tell you that the service from the Board of Nursing in Alabama is excellent. Responsive, quick, easy. That you get a nice hard plastic copy of your license with. It's beautiful. Georgia is awful. It takes us forever to get new hires licensed. We can't get people into jobs because it takes months. The students are submitting the same paperwork over and over again, and it's in 3 different places, and the board is understaffed.
Mr. Davis of the Georgia Nursing Association.
Hello, my name is Tim Davis. I'm the Director of Membership and Government Affairs with the Georgia Nurses Association. We are the state-named professional association representing all registered nurses across all specialties. And so a few of the things that I had notated have already been touched on today, so I'll be brief on those. I did have a few things that I wanted to bring to your attention that have not been mentioned today. One that we see as a licensee safety issue. When a consumer, you, me, or anyone else, goes to the Secretary of State's website in order to verify a nurse's license, their personal information is made available there. An example of that is their home address. And we see that as a licensee safety issue. So perhaps that's something that can be addressed to where their license can be verified, but their public information is not made available, or their personal information is not made available to the public. There's also a workforce data collection and analyzation issue that we struggle with here in the state. The boards have the limited ability to collect and make sense of the data of their licensees. That's the Georgia Physicians Workforce Board, which receives significant funding to analyze their physician workforce and is 1/5 of the population of nurses in our state, is able to do that. And so the Secretary of State's office and member boards are extremely limited in their ability to track and analyze their workforce data of any of the professions under the purview of the Secretary of State's office. And that speaks to funding. I would reiterate what everybody else has said here. We believe that all of the fees generated by licensure should go directly back to that licensing board, understanding that that board best knows how to allocate that money to best serve that population. And finally, I would say that the investigators, when ethical issues are raised, we feel that the investigators should be allocated to the specific boards based on the number of licensees that they have under their purview. We think that this would not only grow the expertise of the individual investigators in that specific license silo, but it would also allow them to address some of the cases that they have open in a more expeditious manner. And with that, I'll
Questions
leave it
of
open for
Mr. Davis from the committee? Representative LaRicchia?
Yeah, you, when you first started out, you were mentioning the, and I was sitting there actually making a note in my phone about it when you stepped up. And did the nursing board make some sort of a recommendation about the personal information of the licensed nurses? I know you mentioned that was a problem, that when people go on to make sure that a nurse is licensed, have they ever brought that issue before the Secretary of State's office? I just thought that was kind of odd and just sort of random that you threw that in there when they have a board that they can appeal to try to make those recommendations at any given time.
It is my understanding that it's by statute that those addresses are there. However, internally within the Board of Nursing, we do need to have everyone's email contact information, but any nurse may keep their personal home address personal with our executive director only. So it is at the nurse's discretion what address is placed on the website.
Okay. Because if we address that, Mr. Chairman, we might want to take our personal home address off of the.
All right, any other question for Mr. Davis? Thank you, Mr. Davis.
If there are no other questions, I just want to say that, you know, the existence of this committee is to be lauded and applauded. And I want to thank the chair and also all of the members of the committee for giving us this forum and platform to be able to bring our recommendations forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. National Association of Social Workers, Mr.
Ted Bordeaux with the
Bordeaux.
National Association of Social Workers Georgia chapter. Our president, Cheryl Harris, sends her regards, but couldn't make it here and provided me with a letter to read some recommendations. We echo much of this testimony that you've heard today with regards to funding and fee distribution. And in the event that there's increased capacity from that, we have some recommendations regarding public safety and public trust. First of all, with consumer safety, with the number of audits that are done, we have a fixed number of audits that are provided each year, and we think that with an increased capacity, you could increase the audit percentage to maintain a greater knowledge of the continuing education that is required by those social workers. We also have a request that a modernization of how the professional licensure boards would meet, in that licensees tend to rely on the rule changes and consumer concerns from the professional standard associations and not the licensure board itself. And if the associations are considered important to staples at scheduled professional licensure board meetings, due to travel limitations and schedule constraints, they may be limited in attendance, and an electronic means to attend the meeting would offer an advantage to the organizations and associations and the users. And so we'd like, to express that what everyone else has said in regards to funding, and then add those two.
Begin that second point again.
We think that the licensees would have a better understanding of new rules and regulations.
Did you say somebody tended to rely
On
on?
the associations that also represent the licensees from the boards.
So clarify that a little bit. The licensees
Licensees join
tend
the
to
association.
rely more on the
Right,
associations.
to spread the message of the board's rulings and rule changes.
Okay.
We also think it would be beneficial for the review of a video conference for the actual individual licensees if they had time to view that message. Similar to this setup.
Very good. And do you know offhand roughly the number your association represents here in Georgia, the number of social workers, licensed social workers?
Licensees were about 3,000.
About 3,000, okay. And you're similar to the others, is it a biannual fee?
Biannual fee of $100, similar to the licensed professional counselors.
2 years. Okay. And then, with some additional, you suggested potentially additional audits. Other than continuing education requirements, are there other items that the auditors on a routine basis are looking for?
That I don't know. I can provide you that information. We
Sure.
can look that up and get that to you.
Okay.
I'll also provide the remainder of this letter.
Very
for
good.
everyone.
Any question for Mr. Bordeaux? Mr. Williams?
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I keep hearing biennial fee, and I'm have to do my license biennial. Could there be an advantage to going to every 3 years or every 4 years? And that's what I'd like to hear from the different boards. I know you have continuing education requirements on some of them, but the continuing education is done anyway. The CEUs are done anyway. But would there be a budget savings of going to every 3 years or every 4 years? I know, LaTrinda, we went to, did funeral directors and funeral homes, did them together. got them, because they were staggering, so we were doing license every year, one or the other. But, and it's biennial, so can you go to every 3 years, every 4 years? Do any of you, different professions, see a problem with that, if I may ask that question?
That would be a,
But do you think it would be savings, bureaucracy, paperwork, budgetary savings, that you're not having to go through that process over and over?
Let me rephrase the question. Do any of the licensed professions in the room have an objection to the potential of extending the length of renewing your license?
I would not object to that.
Right behind you.
I haven't really ever thought about it, but I do have some initial concerns. We pick up on a lot of things like a DUI arrest or an action in another jurisdiction, a disciplinary action in another state, that a lot of times are not reported to us except for when the nurse does do renewal and checks the box. So while I'm not saying I'm opposed, I would certainly want to do some more investigations before I could support that.
Same. Okay, very good, thank you. All right, Representative Bennett.
Yeah, I have a question for you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. You may know, and I also have a question for you. You may know the answer, and the question was prompted by Representative's question. Is there a standard across the country, or do you know if other boards across the country have expanded or extended their time for licensing renewal, and if so, in what industries, and has there been any evidence of its success or failure?
I do not know the answer to that question. My suspicion is that, as we've seen in Georgia, that there are various requirements of various lengths of time all over the board. But I have not investigated that yet. And I think that's a good question, and something we probably should get a little more information on.
That would definitely be something to get some evidence on. Sir, did I understand you to say that most of the licensees rely on their professional associations rather than their boards to get information about board?
I would say part of the association's goal is to let the licensees that are members know that the new changes or rule changes.
So it's a membership
Right, as a benefit of members.
benefit. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Remdy? Ramelli? American Massage Therapy Association.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Sharon Ramelli. I'm the Government Relations Chair for the American Massage Therapy Association, Georgia chapter. A little background about myself. I've been a massage therapist for over 20 years. Before that, I was a military officer. I was a major in the United States Army. And after serving in the military for several years, I was a corporate executive. I was in the Signal Corps, satellite communications, so engineers are near and dear to my heart, because that was a previous life. So I'm here today to just address the number of massage therapists in the state of Georgia. We have approximately 7,000. Our initial fee when we do our application is $125. We, every 2 years, our fee is $75. We are one of the smallest boards, smallest group of 7,000. However, we share resources with 5 other boards: PTs, chiropractors, occupational therapists, podiatrists, veterinarians, and massage therapists. I guess we're all related. Anyway, we all share the same resources. As you're well aware, there have been some issues in the massage world, and one of the issues really has to do, which everybody has mentioned, are the investigators. What we have tried to do is train some of the investigators on what to look for in the massage world. But because some of the legislation didn't get passed in the last session, things are a little loose, right now. And it really needs to be, from the law, needs to be tightened up.
When you say train investigators, is this who's offering training to
So
the?
our board,
is these- is-
actually does some specific training, is my
to
understanding.
SOS staff investigators?
Yes, that was my understanding, from our board and from the past chair and the recent chair. So, but one of the issues, which is a common theme, which, you've heard today, is the lack of investigators, the lack in the numbers. What we're trying to do in the massage world, and we are bringing up some more legislation in this next session, is to tighten up some of the law. We want to have some ID cards. We want to take and put some constraints on some of the areas and bring some consistency in the municipalities and the counties. And we are working very closely with those groups in order to do that. Did I hit on everything? Okay. I guess Stan just said it. Tighten the enforcement is what we would
And
like
so
to
in your
achieve.
estimation, then an expansion of the number of investigators, more trained to better to better understand the industry and what to look for would be advantageous to your industry.
Absolutely, sir.
And as many of the others have stated, developing that higher level of service, that more industry-specific training, with 7,000 practitioners or whatever, you are also in alignment with the others that whatever that kind of fee for service, whatever it takes to provide that level of service in our industry, would be borne by your industry rather than someone else.
And if we have to do that, then
What would
We
the
have to do
alternative be?
I guess we'd have to decide that.
Yeah. Okay.
We'd have to discuss that. I guess one of the issues, and I have a booklet for you all, and also a letter from my national organization, but there's some recent legislation that has come out on a national level that has specifically to do with the Medicare and Medicaid services, which I don't know if you're aware of that or not. But, and I've got some copies of that information for you, which is really put out nicely and mapped out in the letter from my professional organization. But one of the pieces that is really key here is that with the medically approved non-opioid pain management, medically approved non-opioid pain treatment alternatives, massage therapy is recognized as one of those alternatives. The key here, however, is that reimbursement from insurance companies will only take place if the massage therapist is state licensed. Now,
You may have a problem.
that is only state licensed. But that, if you look at it, that has a lot also to do in the income with, with the state and with the insurance and all those factors.
Right.
And so I know that there's been discussion about, well, you're a small, let's just get rid of licensure, a massage therapy. I don't know why you would want to do that.
Yeah, we can have that discussion
Okay.
offline, not
Okay.
relative to this committee,
Okay,
but
I mean,
I agree with you.
I know we only bring in a little over $500,000, but I really hope that you take a look at it from the safety side of the public, because I think that really speaks a lot.
Right, okay. Any
Thank you so much.
questions for Ms. Romali? Representative Williams?
Thank you. I have a question. In order for a licensed massage therapist to open up a facility, a business, hang a sign out, do you have to have any kind of licensure or inspection to do that?
I personally work in a holistic health center, and so I fall under the parameters of the health center, which are pretty strict. And, but if I were to step out and hang my own shingle up, I would have to have a business license. They'd have to come in and check my facility, you know, and all those things.
Does Secretary of State regulate you opening up your own facility?
No.
No?
Absolutely, no.
Okay.
It's that, and that's where each county, each city has a different, you know, parameters. You know, there are some massage therapists in some counties, some municipalities that pay up to $1,000 for a business license, where a physician or chiropractor, dentist pays much less.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, that was the last person on our sign-up sheet from the industries. Was there any individual practitioner or member of the general public that wanted to offer any comment? I don't see any final comment from members of the committee. Anyone else? Very good. If not, I appreciate everyone's participation. I think the input was very valuable, and thank you for that. What we'll do is over the next several weeks, the committee will communicate and work on a draft report, and we'll share it internally and make sure that the report represents the testimony that we heard accurately and the agreement of the members. And then hopefully by the end of the year, we will publish some kind of report of the work of the committee with whatever recommendations may or may not be included in that. But again, I think both from the Gort Commission testimony, the testimony from our Secretary of State's Office of Business Licensing Division, as well as each of you have provided a good basis for us to potentially have a few recommendations that will benefit not only the practice of the professional license practice in Georgia, but the administration of your licensing and the boards as well. So with that, we are adjourned, and thank you again for coming.